The candle on the hall table had burned down to a stub by the time Eliza heard the knock at the side door. She had been the one to answer it all 4 evenings that week, because Mrs. Pearson's knees had swollen again, and no one thought to redistribute the duty, and Eliza had not thought to refuse. That was the kind of woman she was, and the house knew it the way a house knows where the drafts come from and stops noticing them. She opened the door and found a man standing in the October cold without hat or gloves, wearing a coat that fit him across the shoulders as though it had been made for someone slightly narrower. He held himself very still. The lamplight from the street reached him at an angle that caught the line of his jaw and the calm of his expression, but told her nothing else. He said he had come on behalf of a gentleman, and she said she would pass the message along. And, for a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. That was the detail she would return to later, when everything had rearranged itself, and she was trying to sort through what she had known without knowing it. Not the coat that did not quite fit, not the way he looked at her, which was direct and unhurried in a way that men at side doors rarely were. The silence. It had not been the silence of someone waiting to be dismissed. It had been the silence of someone entirely at ease. She closed the door against the cold and carried his message upstairs, and by the time she reached the top landing she had already stopped thinking about him, because there were 3 lamps to fill, and a letter to post in the morning, and 4 years of that kind of not thinking had made her very efficient. The house was Crane House, a tall stone structure on the near edge of a respectable square, and it belonged to Lord Ashford Crane and his wife Margaret in the sense that all things in Eliza's daily world belonged to them. The rooms, the schedule, the hours between dusk and 10 o'clock when the staff were theoretically free, the air Eliza breathed in the upper corridors. She had come to the house 4 years before as a lady's companion, which was the polite name for a function that had expanded steadily into something closer to secretary, reader, scheduler, an occasional target for Margaret's more precise forms of displeasure. Margaret Crane was not a cruel woman in any way that could be proven. Her cruelty was architectural. She built it out of small corrections issued in front of witnesses, out of requests framed as reminders of what a person of Eliza's station ought to know without being told, out of a particular tone she used when Eliza's suggestions were adopted without credit. She was very good at it. It required no raised voice and left no bruise. Eliza's younger sister Nettie worked in the house as well, downstairs, a seamstress who mended the household linens and the family's clothes with a steadiness that made her invisible in the way all useful things are invisible. Nettie was 22 and had their father's dark eyes and their mother's habit of saying the exact true thing at the exact wrong moment. She and Eliza shared a narrow room on the upper floor, and on the evenings when the day had been long, Nettie would sit on the edge of her bed and say something so precise about the household's particular absurdities that Eliza would have to press her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing loud enough to be heard. The message Eliza had carried upstairs that first evening was addressed to Lord Ashford. She did not know its contents. She delivered it to his study and received, in return, a look that suggested she had interrupted something important, which she had not, since the room contained only Ashford, a fire, and a glass of claret. She left the study and went back to filling lamps. The message, as Nettie explained it 2 days later with the flat certainty of someone who had heard it from the kitchen, was from a gentleman named Thomas who wished to call on Eliza formally, and who had sent his valet to arrange the introduction through proper channels, since the gentleman himself was occupied with estate matters and could not present himself in person at this time. "A valet," Eliza said, setting down the pillowcase she was hemming. "A valet," Nettie confirmed. "Ashford apparently knows the gentleman or knows of him, which amounts to the same thing in this house. And Lord Ashford agreed to this? Nettie straightened the seam she was pressing. Lord Ashford told Margaret, and Margaret told Mrs. Pearson, and Mrs. Pearson told Cook, and Cook told me, and I am telling you, which means yes. Everyone has agreed to it except the person it concerns. Eliza picked the pillowcase back up. I don't recall anyone asking me. I don't recall that being how it works, Nettie said, and they were both quiet for a moment, and that was accurate enough that neither of them added anything to it. The following evening, the knock came again at the side door, and Eliza answered it, and the same man was standing there in the same coat that did not quite fit. She noticed this time that his hands were bare again in a night that was properly cold, and that his cuffs were very clean. She noticed also that the coat's buttons were of a finer material than the coat itself, which was an odd combination, and she set the observation aside because it was none of her concern. She offered him tea because it was cold and he had come a distance, whichever distance that was. He looked at her for a moment as though the offer required more consideration than it ordinarily would. Then he said he would not impose, and she said it was no imposition, and he came inside and stood in the narrow hall passage just past the door while she went to fetch the tea herself, since Mrs. Pearson's knees remained uncooperative and the kitchen was close enough. When she came back with 2 cups because she had made 2 without quite deciding to, he was studying the framed botanical print on the hall wall. It was a faded thing, a drawing of a variety of fern that Eliza had always thought looked faintly melancholy, pressed and labelled, and hung precisely at eye level for someone of average height. The man was slightly above average height and had to angle his chin down to read the label, and he was doing this with the full, unhurried attention of someone who had all the time there was. She handed him the cup. He thanked her with the plain simplicity of a person who meant the word. You know botanical illustration, she said, because she was curious and had never learned to suppress curiosity in the presence of people who were unlikely to judge her for having it. A little, he said. My mother kept a garden. She waited to see if he would say more. He did not, which she found restful rather than discouraging. The hall was very quiet. The house was settling around them in its nightly way, wood expanding against the cold, some distant grate clicking, the small sounds of 5 staff moving through their last duties of the evening on the floors above. They drank the tea and he asked after a silence what she read. She told him. Natural history primarily, some philosophy when she could find it. A great deal of correspondence on behalf of Margaret that she did not count. He said he had lately been reading on land management, which he found more absorbing than he had expected. She asked him why he had not expected it to be absorbing. He said it had always struck him as a subject other people found absorbing, and he had been waiting to see whether he was one of those people. And are you? She said. I think I might be, he said. And something in the way he said it was so genuinely uncertain, so far from any kind of performance, that she found herself smiling. And he looked at the botanical print again, and she had the distinct impression that he was smiling too, though she did not catch him doing it. He left when the hall clock struck 9, thanked her again for the tea, and walked back into the cold without any apparent difficulty. She closed the door and stood for a moment with her hand on the latch, not quite sure what she was doing. Then she went upstairs. Nettie was still awake, mending a chemise by candlelight, and she looked up with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a report. He's quiet, Eliza said. Is that good? Yes, Eliza said, and was surprised to discover she meant it. The next morning, Margaret called Eliza into the sitting room before breakfast to review the seating arrangement for the following Thursday's dinner, which was a task that involved moving small cards around a table diagram for 40 minutes, while Margaret described the hierarchies involved in placing a baronet adjacent to a bishop, and which could have been accomplished in 8 minutes if Margaret had trusted Eliza's judgment, which she did not, which was why it took 40. At the conclusion of this exercise, when Eliza had written the final arrangement out in her neatest hand, Margaret looked at it and said, "You've placed Sir Henry too near the windows. He feels the cold." "You told me last year he preferred the windows," Eliza said, which was true, and which she knew the moment she said it was a mistake. Margaret looked at her with the specific expression she kept for these moments, patient and slightly aggrieved, as though Eliza had done something embarrassing in company. "What I said last year," Margaret replied, "was that he tolerates the windows when the alternative is worse. Toleration is not preference, Eliza. You would do well to remember the distinction." The other staff member present in the room, a young parlour-maid named Ruth, who had no visible opinion about windows or baronets, found somewhere else to direct her eyes. Eliza rewrote the card. She did not say anything else. She had learned in 4 years that what she did not say held its shape longer than what she said, and this was a kind of power, even if it was the only kind available to her. She brought the corrected arrangement back to Margaret's desk and set it down with the steadiness of someone who has decided, very firmly, not to be diminished. That afternoon she mentioned it to no one. At 6:30, she was back at the side door, because that was apparently where her evenings went now, and the knock came at the usual time, and the man in the coat that did not fit stood in the doorway with the same bare hands and the same unhurried manner, and she let him in without ceremony, and he followed her to the small parlour off the hall that no one else used on evenings when the family was dining in. This time she brought a lamp. The small parlour was papered in a deep green that had gone slightly brown at the edges, and there was a settee and 2 chairs, and a low table with a crack in its surface that someone had filled with wax at some point in its history. And none of it was elegant, but the room was warm. She sat in one of the chairs, He took the other without being directed to it, which meant he had made a decision about where to sit rather than waiting to be placed. And she noticed this the way she noticed the fern print, setting it aside in the category of small, unexplained things. They talked for a long time. She did not record the duration exactly, but the lamp had shortened considerably by the time he stood to leave, and outside the narrow window, the street had gone very dark. They had spoken about natural history and about the particular difficulty of reading philosophy in a house where no one else did, and about whether a kitchen garden in clay soil could be made productive, which she suspected it could, and he apparently had recent practical opinions about. He did not mention the gentleman he was meant to represent. She did not ask. The arrangement had been that the valet would come to introduce the courtship on behalf of his employer, and she supposed that was what was happening, and yet the conversation had not once felt like an arrangement. When he left, she stood at the door slightly longer than she needed to, watching the lamplight from the street catch the line of his coat until he turned the corner and was gone. Upstairs, Nettie said, "You look like someone thinking about something." "I'm always thinking about something," Eliza said. "Not like that, you're not," Nettie said, and returned to her mending with the satisfied expression of someone who has made a precise observation and does not require it to be confirmed. The following Thursday, after the baronet had survived his proximity to the bishop and Margaret had received enough compliments on the table to restore her disposition, Eliza was passing the door of Ashford's library on her way to the back stairs when she heard Margaret speaking inside. The library door was not fully latched. It had a habit of swinging slightly open unless the handle was turned firmly, and apparently no one had turned it firmly. She was not pausing. She was walking past. The distance between walking past and stopping was a distance of about 3 seconds, and she was in the middle of those 3 seconds when she heard her own name. She stopped. "I cannot imagine what Thomas was thinking," Margaret was saying, and her tone was the one she used for problems that were beneath her but nonetheless required management. "Eliza is a perfectly adequate companion, but adequate is precisely the word. She is plain and she is careful, and she has no family to speak of and no prospects that would make the connection sensible. Whatever his intentions are, they will not come to anything real. A man of his position does not end that way, Ashford." There was a pause. Then Ashford's voice, lower and less invested, said something that contained the words, "harmless enough," and trailed off. "Harmless," Margaret said, "until it isn't. She has ideas about her own value, Ashford. She always has. That is what makes her manageable in small doses and tedious over time." Eliza stood in the corridor for 2 seconds more, and then she walked to the back stairs and went up them and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the floor. She did not cry. That was not because she was not hurt. It was because the particular quality of what she had heard was not the sharp kind of pain that produces tears, but the flat kind that produces a rearrangement, the slow recognition that a room you thought you understood has different walls than you believed. She had known, in a general way, that Margaret found her useful without finding her valued. She had not known that Margaret had expressed this opinion to her husband as though it were simply a description of a fact about the weather. She had ideas about her own value. She sat with that sentence for a long time. She did not reject it. She tried it on carefully, the way you press on a bruise to find its edges, and she found that it did not fit the shape she understood herself to have. She was not a woman with ideas about her own value. She was a woman with no particular claims at all, who had simply never agreed to reduce herself to the size that other people's comfort required. These were not the same thing, and she had always known they were not the same thing. And Margaret had said the sentence with such certainty that for a few minutes in the dim light of the upper room, Eliza could not find the words to explain the difference. Nettie came up an hour later and found her still sitting there. She looked at Eliza's face and did not ask any questions, which was the truest form of kindness Nettie had. She sat on her own bed and said, in a matter-of-fact voice, "I brought you some bread and butter. Cook made the good bread today, and there was extra." Eliza took the bread. They ate in the quiet room while the house settled around them, and outside the window the October wind moved along the square without stopping anywhere. And after a while Eliza said, "I'm all right," and Nettie said, "I know," and neither of them needed to say anything more. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, one of the downstairs maids, a woman named Agnes, who had been at Crane House longer than Eliza, and who carried the quiet authority of someone who has outlasted several reorganizations, came to Eliza's door before breakfast, looking pale. "I can't do the Thursday round," Agnes said. "My head is something awful. I told Mrs. Pearson, but Mrs. Pearson says if I don't show up, I won't be paid for the day." The Thursday round was a long circuit of the house's ground floor rooms, aired out the carpets and the heavy drapes in rotation, required carrying things down corridors and up steps, and took most of the morning. It also happened to be Eliza's half-day, the single unencumbered half-day she had each week, and this particular Thursday was the 4th evening, which was when she had expected the man in the ill-fitting coat to knock again. She looked at Agnes for a moment. Agnes was genuinely pale. She had the kind of pallor that belonged to someone whose head was, in fact, something awful. "Go back to bed," Eliza said. "I'll do the round." Agnes said, "Your half-day," and Eliza said, "Go back to bed," in the same tone, and Agnes went. She did the round. It took until midday. She put the drapes right and shook the carpets and carried the heavy brass candlesticks from their storage cabinet to the dining room table and back again, because Margaret had changed her mind about using them that week. By the time she finished, her arms ached and her back ached, and she smelled of dust and old wool. And the afternoon was gone, and she had missed whatever arrangement had been made for the evening. She did not think much about it. That was not a performance of indifference. She had simply learned in 4 years that she was not the kind of person whose choices were watched, and she acted accordingly. And this was one of those choices, and she had made it because it was the right one to make, and for no other reason. What she did not know, could not have known, was that she was wrong about not being watched. He had come to the side door at the usual time. He had stood in the street for a moment, waiting, and then he had gone quietly around to the kitchen entrance because there was a window there that opened at street level, and through which the interior of the lower hall was visible if you knew to look. And he had looked, and he had seen her come through the hall passage with an armful of draping fabric, and her hair coming loose at the back, and her face wearing the expression of someone doing a task they have accepted completely. He had watched for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he had walked away, and she had never known he was there. By the time this had all rearranged itself in Eliza's understanding, a week had gone by, and it was a Friday morning, and she was in the front hall of Crane House rearranging a vase of late dahlias that Margaret had declared were drooping when the main door opened. Mrs. Pearson admitted a man Eliza did not recognize, a thin man in good quality, black with a leather document case under his arm, who announced himself as Mr. Hartwell, a solicitor, and said he was here to call on Lord Ashford regarding estate accounts. Mrs. Pearson took his coat and led him toward the library, and Eliza returned to the dahlias. She heard Ashford's voice in the library, a brief exchange with Mrs. Pearson, and then footsteps in the hall, and then Lord Ashford himself appeared in the doorway of the front hall, not in his usual manner of owning every room by visible intention, but with a slightly surprised expression, the expression of a man who had just been handed something unexpected. Behind him, coming in through the front door in what should have been an unusual circumstance for a man who had spent 3 evenings at the side, was Thomas. He was not wearing the coat that did not fit. He was wearing his own clothes, which were simply and well made, and which fit him across the shoulders as though they had been designed for exactly those shoulders, which they had. He was carrying nothing. He looked exactly the same as he had looked in the narrow hall passage and in the small parlour off the back corridor, which is to say he looked entirely himself, which was, she was now rapidly understanding, the problem. The solicitor Hartwell had apparently arrived expecting to find the gentleman he served already present, and finding him not yet arrived, had simply opened the library door and greeted him as he came in from the street, the way solicitors greet clients they have known for some years, which is without preamble or ceremony. "Mr. Thomas Clark," Hartwell said, in the easy voice of a man who has said the name in a great many rooms. "Good of you to come. I've the Whitmore accounts ready, and the 3 property deeds we discussed need your signature before the 1st of the month." Lord Ashford turned toward Thomas with an expression Eliza had never seen on his face before, a careful, recalibrating stillness, the expression of a man reassessing the height of a step he had already placed his foot on. Thomas looked at Lord Ashford and said, "Ashford," in the mild way of one acquaintance acknowledging another, without any change in his manner at all. The library was to the left. Margaret had come to the library door. Nettie had appeared at the top of the back stairs, attracted by some alteration in the house's usual sounds, and stood now at the landing looking down. Ruth, the parlour-maid, had emerged from the dining-room with a polishing cloth in her hand and a very neutral expression on her face. Agnes, recovered from her head, was visible at the far end of the hall passage, and she was looking at Eliza. Eliza was still holding a dahlia. She looked at the man she had made tea for 3 times, the man who had drunk it without performance, who had asked her what she read, who had told her his mother kept a garden. who had stood in the narrow hall passage in a coat that was not his, and said nothing that was untrue, who had apparently been sending his own valet to act as go-between in a courtship he had then decided to conduct himself, which meant that the valet in question had been Thomas, and the valet Thomas had sent ahead to the door had been, apparently, himself wearing Doyle's coat. The room was very quiet. Margaret said, "Thomas," and then stopped and began again. "That is to say, Mr. Clark, I had not realized you were expected today. We would have— I ought to have been," and stopped again. Ashford said nothing. He was looking at Thomas with the focused attention of someone performing an extremely rapid social calculation. Thomas had not looked at anyone except Eliza since the solicitor had said his name. She looked at him directly, which she had not quite done in the small parlour. Not like this, not with the full, plain regard of a person who is seeing rather than observing. He held her look without flinching, without explanation, without asking forgiveness. His expression was the same one he had worn at the botanical fern print and over the 2 cups of tea and across the small parlour in the lamplight, a careful, unreserved attention directed entirely at her. He said, "I should have told you at the beginning. I considered it, and I was wrong to decide against it." She said nothing for a moment. The room was still very quiet. The dahlia in her hand had a stem she had been pressing between her fingers, without noticing, and the stem had made a faint crease in her palm. "Why the coat?" she said. "Doyle's," he said. "My own would have placed me before I had said anything." "And you wanted to say something first?" "I wanted to know," he said, "what it felt like to be in a room with someone who hadn't already decided what I was." The silence after this had a different quality than the silence before it. It was the silence of a sentence that has found its exact landing place and does not require any addition. Nettie, from the landing at the top of the back stairs, made no sound. Agnes, at the end of the hall passage, had stopped moving. Ruth still had the polishing cloth. Margaret had her mouth slightly open in the attitude of a woman who has begun 3 sentences and cannot complete any of them. And in her face was the particular expression of someone whose careful architecture has been disclosed as a structure built on a misreading of the foundations. Ashford cleared his throat. He said, "Mr. Clark, we are of course delighted," and the sentence had a slightly hollow sound, the sound of a formal expression reaching for conviction and not quite finding it. He was a man who understood rank with great precision, and he was in the process of adjusting his understanding of exactly whose rank was whose in this particular hall at this particular moment, and the adjustment was visible in the effort required to make his face behave. Thomas turned his attention to Hartwell and said, "Give me 20 minutes." And Hartwell, who was a solicitor and therefore untroubled by the domestic weather of any room, said he would wait in the library, and went there and closed the door. Thomas looked at Eliza again. He said, "I came each evening through the side door because I was not sure you would see me if I came to the front. I was wrong to manage it that way. I am not asking you to find it acceptable." She set the dahlia down on the hall table beside the vase. She was aware that 7 people in various positions around her were either watching or not watching with great precision, and she was also aware that this information was, for the first time in 4 years, not the most important thing in the room. "You asked me what I read," she said. "I did. Most people don't ask." "I noticed that," he said. She looked at him for a moment more, long enough to satisfy herself that the face was the same face, and the voice was the same voice. And, whatever she had been noticing in the small parlour without knowing what she was noticing, was still present, and was, apparently, what it had appeared to be. "You may come in through the front door," she said, "when you have finished with Mr. Hartwell." He looked at her with the same expression he had worn over the fern print, full, unhurried attention. He said, "Thank you," in exactly the way he had thanked her for the tea, which was the plain, unornamented way of a person who means the word entirely. Margaret said something that contained the word arrangements and the phrase quite understand, and faded without completing itself. Ashford had already retreated towards the library, which was the direction in which he could most efficiently avoid being present for whatever had just happened. Agnes disappeared back down the hall passage. Ruth remembered the polishing cloth. Nettie came down the back stairs with the quiet, deliberate tread of someone who has been waiting a long time to walk down a particular set of stairs and intends to take her time with it. She arrived at the bottom and stood beside Eliza and looked at the front door, which Thomas had already passed through on his way to the library, and then at the hall table, and then at her sister. She said in a low voice, "The coat never fit him right." "I noticed," Eliza said. "You didn't say anything." "I didn't know what I was noticing." Nettie picked up the dahlia Eliza had set down, looked at it, and placed it back in the vase with the others. "I think," she said, with the careful precision of someone who has been sitting on a sentence for several days and has finally found the right moment to say it, "that you always knew. You just didn't have the word for it yet." Eliza was quiet. The front hall of Crane House held its light differently in the morning than in the evening. And at this hour the autumn sun came through the transom window above the main door at a low, gold-grey angle that reached the floor in a long, narrow stripe. And Eliza had stood in that stripe of light many times in 4 years, while carrying something, or delivering something, or waiting to be told what was needed next. She stood in it now, without carrying anything. The house moved around her in its usual way, the quiet industry of 5 people's useful morning, a door somewhere, a grate, the smell of coal smoke, and the faint warmth of the kitchen rising through the back passage. All of it familiar, all of it the same. She put her hand on the smooth painted wood of the front door frame, the place she had touched every morning for 4 years when she opened it for someone else, and felt the grain of it under her palm, cool and worn to something almost silken at the height, where hands habitually landed. Behind the closed library door, she could hear the low, even rhythm of Thomas's voice explaining something to the solicitor about the Whitmore accounts, patient and specific. The voice of a man who understands numbers and does not perform the understanding. The same voice that had said it had always struck him as a subject other people found absorbing, and he had been waiting to see whether he was one of those people. She had believed him when he said it. She believed him still. Nettie had gone back upstairs. The hall was empty. Eliza stood at the door she had once guarded and let the autumn light lie where it wanted, across the floor, across her hand, across whatever came next. The library door would open in 20 minutes, and Thomas would come through the front hall and stop, and she would be standing there. And that would be enough for now. That would be the whole sufficient fact of it. She was not waiting to be collected or retrieved or granted a change in position. She was simply standing in the light, in the hall, in the house, in her own particular life, which had just shifted quietly and completely along its axis. The stripe of sun moved a fraction as the morning advanced, the way light always moves in rooms you know well enough to stop seeing, and Eliza noticed it the way she noticed everything. The cup, the cloth, the fern print, the silence that was never the silence of someone waiting to be dismissed. She had given the man her half-day without intending to and without knowing it was a gift. She had answered the side door without ceremony and offered the tea because it was cold and for no other reason. She had asked him what he read about because she was curious, and had never learned to suppress curiosity in the presence of people unlikely to judge her for it. She had done none of these things as a strategy. She had done them because they were, when all the hierarchy and arrangement and social management of Crane House was set aside, simply the right way to be with another person. He had come back 3 evenings in a coat that did not fit, and she had made tea each time, and the house had not once asked whether she was being watched. She had not known she was being watched. She had not needed to know. The library door opened. His footfall in the corridor was quiet and unhurried. The same unhurried pace he had used on every threshold he had crossed in this house. And when he came through the door and into the light of the front hall, he stopped as she had known he would, and he looked at her as she had known he would, and the morning held very still around them both. She moved her hand from the doorframe and stepped back, making room. He came in.